Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 339. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well. Bad news, though, Connor. Sorry, I don't think this is going to be a show with really anything uplifting for people, but a lot of really important news to get through today. So, just want to ask people to share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey for the video version of the show. You can find the audio podcast anywhere you can listen to podcasts. It's also on the Libertarian Institute, all podcast feed, along with the Scott Horton Show and Liberty Weekly, and our now Vital Descent, Patrick McFarland. Same show I was just on this past week, so check it out if you want. And then Don't Tread on Anyone, Keith Knight. So a lot of great stuff on that feed. And you can support the show by supporting our sponsor, doing your CBD shopping with Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde. CBD.com. Promo code PEACE. Connor, what do you like from Paloma Verde?
I really enjoy those tinctures. They're the best bang for your buck, strongest stuff, lasts a very long time. You're getting like 6-7 hours of pain relief. And it's fantastic for a good night's sleep, I can tell you that. The soft gels are just about as good. If people don't like tinctures, you just take those after a meal and kick in after 30 minutes, and any kind of inflammation or pain you're dealing with, stress, whatever it is, anxiety, this will take care of that, and just make your day much better. If you're trying to recover from exercise or something, the soft gels are perfect. The gummy bears are terrific. I always take those on the go. They're delicious and they hit you instantly. And then the doggy treats are always great because if you have an older dog who's just a little bit anxious around the house, if you live in a noisy area, or if they just have some joint pain or something, that can make their lives a lot better. And they appear to be very good. I haven't tried them myself. My dog seems to really enjoy them when I give them to her. So definitely check those out.
Paloma Verde, CBD.com, promo code PEACE. Let's get into the news. And Connor, I want to start off with a story that we, really already covered on this show because it was an article that I wrote for antiwar.com on this past Friday, so almost a week ago. But the story ends up getting picked up by Zero Hedge, which frequently reprints what I write, particularly at antiwar.com. And so this article was the one I wrote on the steadfast noon war games, US B-52 bombers taking part in these massive war games, drilling, potential nuclear warfare with Russia, nuclear warfare in Europe. And so this tweet from Zero Hedge got a reply from Elon Musk. And so it wasn't a retweet, it was just a reply. But Musk having over 100 million Twitter followers means that this article that I wrote, it got quite a bit more reach than the normal article I wrote. Musk's tweet was obviously sarcastic, saying practice makes perfect here, because do you really want to have perfection in nuclear warfare? The whole thing is rather disgusting. But Musk's tweet ends up with 45,000 likes. The Zero Hedge tweet of just my article has 17.2 thousand already, nearly 3,000 retweets. The article itself has almost 200,000 views, and so really cool that Elon Musk is not only taking the time to talk about this issue a little bit, because Connor, I gotta tell you, there's not a lot of people with a lot of influence that are taking any time at all to talk about this, even though we had the president of the United States admitting we're at closer to nuclear Armageddon than any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so if you think about what that means, and the fact that nobody is talking about this, it's really a crazy scenario to be in. And so the article got a lot of traction, obviously, which was great, and everything. And again, this isn't all Musk is doing. He tweeted out the Twitter peace plan that we previously covered on the show. And again, as I pointed out when I covered that article, and I'll point it out again now, I'm not an Elon Musk fanboy. The SpaceX does defense contracts. Musk SpaceX Starlink has been essential for Ukraine to wage the war. I'm an anti-war activist. I got a problem with this stuff. However, the fact that he is somebody with as large of a profile and with as big of a bank account that he has, making a big deal out of this, it's going to draw some more eyeballs to the issue. And look, his peace plan doesn't have any chance of happening. Even the Russians say, like, we're not going to hold another referendum vote in the four annexed areas, which is a core part of Musk's peace plan. But, even the Kremlin was able to recognize that, hey, anybody pushing potential negotiations is really important. Now I want to move on and talk about probably a far more important story that will, never get anywhere near the amount of attention. Ukraine food export deal in jeopardy as Moscow demands West live up to commitments. And I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on October 18th. A key international agreement that has allowed food products to be shipped from Ukrainian ports is at risk of not being extended. The deal helped to push the country's grain exports close to pre-war levels. After Russia invaded its neighbor in February, Ukraine's ports became inaccessible because of Kiev's water mines and Moscow's warships. Turkey and the UN brokered an agreement in July to allow commercial ships to safely transport food products from Ukrainian ports, marking the only successful diplomacy between Kiev and Moscow to date. On Monday, a top Russian official met with a UN representative in Moscow. The Russian deputy defense minister told the UN representative that the Kremlin believes the West is not living up to its commitments under the agreement. In statements posted on Telegram, the Russian Ministry of Defense said the probability of extending the Black Sea Initiative directly depends on ensuring the full implementation of all previously reached agreements. In September, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov argued the West was refusing to remove sanctions, which interfered with the shipment of Russian agricultural products, saying, "Our Western colleagues are not doing what they promised by the UN Secretary General. They are not taking decisions to remove the logistics sanctions that prevent the free access of Russian grain and fertilizer to world markets." And so, kind of with everything that's of Russia that's been sanctioned, and we see this with Iran and Venezuela and other countries, where the White House will say, "Oh, we encourage companies to sell medical supplies to Iran. We encourage people to sell food to Venezuela." But then, when they say, "Oh, we encourage American importers to buy Russian fertilizer," even now, the reality is that that doesn't happen because everybody who has to be involved in the supply chain has to, be willing to take this risk of running afoul of the U.S. Treasury Department, and companies just aren't willing to do that. Additionally, both Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Turkish counterpart, Tayyip Erdogan, have noted other issues with the agreement. In September, Putin observed that most of the food exports were going to wealthier countries that sanctioned Russia rather than low-income nations. Despite fierce fighting ongoing in eastern Ukraine, the grain agreement has succeeded in moving tens of millions of tons of food products from the country, allowing exports to reach levels approaching normal. During the first 2 weeks of October, grain shipments were only down 2.4% compared to the same period last year. Moscow offered suggestions on resolving the issues and extending the agreement. The parties reviewed the details of the implementation of the project for exportation of grain from Ukrainian ports in direct connection with the implementation of the agreements and exportation of Russian agricultural products and fertilizers, the Defense Ministry statement said, adding UN initiatives on prisoners of war, that the promotion of Russian ammonia to the world markets using the available infrastructure were also discussed during the meeting. The UN floated the idea of extending the agreement to ammonium in September, with Chief Executive Ed Weiner stating the absence from the market of ammonia formerly shipped through Ukraine has caused substantial hardships in countries dependent on that product. We believe that the resumption of shipments will help stabilize fertilizer prices worldwide and avoid a global food crisis. Kiev says it's open to continuing the existing agreement, which is set to expire at the end of November, though it remains unclear if it is willing to accept the Russian alterations to the deal. Now, the next article I wrote with Will Porter on October 20th at the Libertarian Institute. Western nations speed up Ukraine arm transfers to prepare for winter warfare. The United States and its NATO allies are accelerating transfers of arms, warm clothing, and anti-drone technologies to Ukraine in preparation for months of bitter combat through the winter. Washington believes shoring up frontline forces before mud and ice set in will help Kiev hold ground over the coming season. Speaking on condition of anonymity during a recent NATO summit in Berlin, a Western official told reporters that the alliance has already started providing winter gear, claiming the Ukrainians are on their front foot and clearly feel prepared for the winter campaign, and that foreign aid is currently very much focused on the winter. While top officials acknowledge that the snow, mud, and ice will slow troop movements, they believe Kiev can continue to push the counteroffensive to reclaim territory now occupied by Russian soldiers despite the frigid temperatures. I expect that Ukraine will continue to do everything it can throughout the winter to regain its territory and to be effective on the battlefield, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said. Ukraine has gained ground from Russia over the last 2 months and is advancing into regions which Moscow now claims as its own territory. President Vladimir Putin vowed to use his entire arsenal to defend all of Russia, including 4 recently annexed regions of Ukraine, which voted to join the Russian Federation in an internationally disputed referendum last month. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg echoed Austin's optimism about Ukraine's chances of making progress against Russians during the cold season. Our task is to enable them to be able to conduct meaningful operations throughout the winter and continue to supply them with everything from fuel, winter clothing, tents, and advanced weapon systems, he said. Kiev is heavily dependent on the West to train its soldiers and supply arms, ammunition, and battlefield intelligence since Russian forces invaded. In that time, the White House has approved at least $70 billion in aid to Kiev, much of that devoted to heavy weapons and vehicles, including long-range multi-launch rocket platforms, artillery pieces, shoulder-fired rockets, helicopters, and drones. Though U.S. arms stockpiles have become increasingly depleted after countless rounds of arms shipments, the flow of aid appears to carry on at present pace, with Secretary Austin declaring that Washington will continue to do everything we can to make sure that Kiev has what is required to be effective. So I want to move on, and I got just 2 more articles on what's happening in Ukraine that is really important here, Connor. So this is from Dave DeCamp on October 17th. Russia says it launched more attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Russia on Monday said it launched more attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure as Kiev came under bombardment from Russian kamikaze drones in the past 24 hours. The Russian armed forces continued delivering strikes by long-range air and sea-based high-precision weapons against Ukrainian military command centers and energy infrastructure facilities. All the designated targets were struck. And Connor, Russia has really ramped up its campaign, particularly against civilian energy infrastructure, since the bombing of the Kerch Bridge that of course connects Crimea to the rest of Russia, and civilian bridge situation. So Russia has responded by carrying out targets on civilian infrastructure. Ukraine of course continues to push its advance. And then Connor, there was this interesting story, Dave DeCamp wrote it up. An American advisor to the Ukraine's army, Dan Rice, told CNN that Russia was trying to get back to the negotiating table to go back to the 2014 lines. Now, there's a lot that could be extrapolated here. Maybe the Russians really are reaching out. Maybe they really are looking to go back to 2014 lines. But that seems unlikely to me based on the recent statements that we've heard from the Kremlin saying that, they're not going to negotiate not only on the Donbass region, the Donetsk and Luhansk oblast of Ukraine, but then also in the south, the Zaporizhia and the Kherson regions. I don't think Russia is going going to be willing to give up as well. Not to mention, going back to 2014 lines is a fairly complex statement because at the time, Russia only controlled like half of Luhansk and less than half of the Donetsk regions of Ukraine, where now they control over half of the Donetsk and I think almost all of Luhansk. So, there had to be a lot of territory changing hands for that to happen. My guess is that this was like kind of a stunt by the Ukrainian government to try to make Russia look weak, but I don't know. Just want to bring this one up and talk about it. Connor, gonna turn it over to you. I know you have a lot of important stuff to talk about when it comes to the Iran deal in China.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so we'll start with this. So, Ned Price in the State Department is announcing that the Iran deal is not our focus. So, on this is on Wednesday. This is last week. This is from Wednesday of last week. We had Ned Price, State Department spokesman, coming out and saying that reviving the JCPOA is not our focus now. Of course, the negotiations have stalled since the beginning of September. He blames the Iranians for the impasse. Of course, they've been increasing sanctions, steadily, and especially now with the protests rocking the country as well. So Price said a deal certainly does not appear imminent. Nothing we've heard in recent weeks suggests that they have changed their position. Price said that their main focus right now is the protests going on inside Iran, and of course, it were sparked by the death of Kurdish Iranian woman. It's disputed how she died, but that she died in police custody. The U.S. has issued sanctions on Iran over Tehran's response to the demonstrations, and of course has expressed support for the protesters. The U.S. has adjusted some sanctions to give protesters more internet access. Again, Elon Musk, the CEO of SpaceX, has said that he was activating Starlink satellite internet inside Iran, but in order to do that, you need terminals, and it's not clear if the U.S. is going to be smuggling them into Iran as of yet. In an interview earlier this month, William Burns, the director of the CIA, was asked if the U.S. government would get the terminals inside the country, and he said, quote, "Well, the U.S. government has made very clear our support for the free flow of information and freedom of the internet. So without going into any details, I think the United States is very committed to that." When asked if the U.S. was getting involved in the protests, Burns said, "All I can say is we are going to continue to be strongly supportive as a government in the free flow of information." All right, so we have the EU warning that there's going to be more sanctions over. Now they're saying that Iran is supplying Russia with drones again. Previously, back in July, before Biden went off and did his tour of the Middle East with notable stops off in Israel and Saudi Arabia. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, came out and said Iran is providing drones to Russia for the war in Ukraine. And then after the Middle East trip, and I forget how many weeks afterwards, but John Kirby came out, the spokesman of the National Security Council, came out and admitted that actually we have no evidence that that's true at all. And of course, it doesn't stop people from continuing to make the accusation and using Sullivan's own words somehow as evidence. But nevertheless, this is now gaining much more steam. And we, of course, back then we covered how Moon of Alabama was showing how Russia is not in need of Iranian drones. But this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue all of a sudden, much like the protests. I mean, all of this is going to be used to just flush any chance of the deal being restored away. But yeah, this is getting very very heated right now. So we have these sanctions have come to fruition. I'll get to that in a moment. But we had EU ministers on Monday agreeing to sanction Iran over their role in Iranian officials over the role in cracking down on the protests inside Iran, which in some cases we have people using Molotov cocktails, burning police stations, and shooting guns at security forces and all kinds of stuff. So the whole thing has been very chaotic and not the romantic story that we're getting over the mainstream media. But regardless, they're warning of more potential sanctions if they can prove that Tehran is providing Russia with these kamikaze drones for the war in Ukraine. So Kiev and other areas in Ukraine were struck by Russian drones that are known as the Geranium-2 unmanned UAVs, which are said, the accusation is that these are just Shahed 136 drones that are Iranian, that have just been repainted and they've just changed the tail numbers and things. But this is Tehran denies this, as do the Russians. So we have EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, who, of course, for months we've been seeing he's been the most active guy in restoring talks when it looked like they were practically dead. But now he's coming out and saying that the minister is going to discuss how to respond to the attacks and Iran's alleged role. He said, quote, "This is something that will be discussed, and we will look for concrete evidence about the participation of Iran in the war." This was according to Financial Times. So on Monday, Iran denied that they were supplying Russia with the drones. And we had Nasser Kanani, the spokesman for the foreign ministry, say that the published news about Iran providing Russia with drones has political ambitions and it's circulated by Western sources. We have not provided weaponry to any side of the countries at war. Referring to the Iranian denial, Borrell said, "Well, let's see." And then the way they word this is very disturbing. The White House also responded and accused Tehran of lying. So Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, said, quote, "You have all seen the reports this morning of what appears to be an Iranian drone strike in downtown Kiev. Yet Iran continues to lie about this." The way they're wording it is very disturbing. Okay, so now here's where it gets interesting, because I just would like to, remind people the relationship Iran has had over the course of the war with Ukraine and Russia has been pretty complex. They were apparently passing messages back and forth between Kiev and Moscow. And at one point, they had even been selected as the country to present Moscow with a peace deal offer from a very prominent Western leader. And it's suspected that that was Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. I wrote an article about this for the Institute, and it was very interesting to note that Iran would be in that kind of a position. That, for one thing, that someone like Macron or whoever that actually was would select Tehran to deliver that message in a meeting where I believe it was Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the foreign minister, visiting Moscow to talk to Lavrov. I mean, that's very interesting in and of itself, but also the fact that they have been passing messages back and forth between Kiev and Moscow. It makes them a very unique sort of puts them in a unique position in terms of the diplomacy. But now, I mean, this is now we have Zelensky and the Ukrainians are really going after Iran quite a bit now. So, but Iran is saying, and this is from Al Jazeera, that they're ready to talk to Kiev about these claims about them arming Russia. So this is from Al Jazeera. The Iranian government says that it's ready to talk to Ukrainian officials to address the allegations that it is arming Russia and that it plans to ramp up military cooperation with Moscow. In a statement issued late on Tuesday, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani reiterated Tehran's denials about sending the drones to Russia to be used in the conflict, and for the first time expressed readiness for, quote, dialogue and negotiation with Ukraine to clear these allegations. It came after the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said on Monday that he had proposed to Zelensky the formal breaking of diplomatic ties with Iran after Russia's latest attacks, which killed several people and damaged infrastructure. Kuebla said the Ukrainian government has no doubts that Iranian Shahed 136 kamikaze drones were used in Monday's attacks and believed Tehran would possibly continue supplying arms to Moscow. Separately, the New York Times on Tuesday cited unnamed U.S. officials as saying that Iran, after selling drones to Russia, had sent trainers from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, to Crimea to help Russian forces operate them. It followed reports by other Western media that Tehran was preparing to send more drones in addition to transferring short and medium-range surface-to-surface missiles. In a speech on Wednesday, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei appeared to reference the alleged drone sales to Russia by saying, "When photos of our advanced missile and drone equipment were published a few years ago, our enemies said they are photoshopped. Now they say that Iranian drones are very dangerous and ask, why do you sell them?" he said, without directly mentioning the war in Ukraine. Ukraine accuses Russia of using the Shahed 136, as I said, with just branded with its own tail numbers. And this is a relatively cheap, fairly accurate drone that can fly long distances before crashing into targets with the explosives that are built in. And Ukraine, which downgraded diplomatic ties to Tehran last month, has been vocal about the purported use of the Iranian drones, with Zelensky and his top officials directly blaming them several times for attacks on Kiev and elsewhere in the country. Um, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry in a tweet last week said, quote, Shahed killer, showing the image of a young pilot who supposedly downed several of these drones. The Kremlin on Tuesday said that Russian technology with Russian names was being used in Ukraine and referred questions to the defense ministry. On Monday, Ukraine called on the European Union to impose sanctions on Iran for the alleged arms sales, with Quebla saying that he was prepared to offer evidence. And then we had Joseph Borrell saying that the EU was reviewing evidence at its disposal and that they would only impose the sanctions if they could independently verify these arms sales to Russia. Um, Now, I mean, so while repeatedly denying these arms sales to Russia for the purpose of being used in Ukraine, we have Iranian officials who have said that yes, we have active defense cooperation with Russia, but they don't elaborate. But it's still they're both officially denying it. Um, and But here's this next story about how Russia and Iran are opposing this idea that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres should launch a mission inside Ukraine to take a look at these drones, basically. So we have Russia warning the UN against investigating its use of drones in Ukraine amid accusations that these weapons are coming from Iran and were used in violation of UN arms restrictions on Iran. So the US, France, and the United Kingdom called a closed-door Security Council meeting of the UN on the drones after an attack on Kiev on Monday that killed at least 5 people and caused widespread damage to power stations and other civilian infrastructure. But Ukraine says its military has shot down more than 220 Iranian drones in little more than a month and has invited Gutierrez to Ukraine to inspect some of this wreckage. So speaking after the Security Council meeting on Wednesday, Russia's deputy UN ambassador Dmitry Polyansky insisted that the weapons have been made in Russia and condemned the baseless accusations and conspiracy theories. He called on Guterres and his staff to, quote, abstain from engaging in any illegitimate investigation. Otherwise, we will have to reassess our collaboration with them, which is hardly in anyone's interest. The U.S. and the European Union say that they have evidence that Iran supplied Russia with Shahed 136s. And Washington says that any arms transfer was in contravention of Security Council Resolution 2231, which is part of the JCPOA. Now, on Wednesday, Iran's UN envoy, Amir Sayed Arevani, rejected the, quote, unfounded and unsubstantiated claims on the drone transfers and said Tehran, which has abstained in votes on the war, wanted a, quote, peaceful resolution of the conflict, which began when Russia sent its troops into Ukraine on the 24th of February. Arvani said Ukraine's invitation lacks any legal foundation and called on Guterres to prevent any misuse of the resolution and UN officials on issues related to the Ukraine war. Quote, Iran is of the firm belief that none of its arms exports, including UAVs to any country, violate Resolution 2231. Under the resolution, a conventional arms embargo on Iran was in place until October of 2020. But Ukraine and its Western allies argue that the resolution still includes restrictions on missiles and related technologies until October 2023 and can encompass the export and purchase of advanced military systems such as drones. So that is the dispute there. But now today, the British and the EU imposed sanctions on Iran over these drones. So the UK government, this is from Middle East Eye, this is Britain's sanctions Iran for supplying drones to Russia. So London on Thursday imposed sanctions on 3 Iranian generals and an arms firm over Russia's use of Iranian drones to bomb Ukraine, matching new EU sanctions. The Treasury added Iranian drone maker Shahed Aviation Industries and 3 top Iranian military officials to its sanctions list, citing the supply of drones to Russia for use, quote, for use in their illegal invasion of Ukraine. Foreign Secretary James Cleverly said that Iran's support for Putin's brutal and illegal war against Ukraine is deplorable. Today, we are sanctioning those who have supplied the drones used by Russia to target Ukrainian civilians. This is clear evidence of Iran's destabilizing role in global security, he said, after the EU imposed sanctions on the same arms firm and individuals. So on Thursday, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the foreign minister of Iran, denied these media reports that Tehran planned to send missiles to Russia for use in the war, citing U.S. and allied security officials. The Washington Post reported Sunday as well that. So again, we had these unnamed officials saying that they're sending this. They're also preparing to send more surface-to-surface missiles as well, in addition to the drones. Military analysts and Western officials say Russia's use of Iranian drones is an indication of a depleted missile stockpile. But Hossein Amir Abdollahian said on Twitter, during a telephone conversation with EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, I told him that our politics is that we are opposed to the war and its escalation in Ukraine. The allegation of sending Iranian missiles to Russia for use against Ukraine is without foundation. We have cooperation in defense matters with Russia, but it is certainly not our politics to send arms and drones against Ukraine. All right. So we will update that next week as well and see if anything else comes out about this alleged evidence that the Europeans in Washington claim to have. Okay, so we're going to move over into China. So opening the 20th National Congress for the Chinese Communist Party on Sunday, we had President Xi Jinping a warning against interference from outside forces regarding the Taiwan issue. Xi's speech did not mark a change in policy for Taiwan, and he didn't mention the U.S., but his warning against interference comes, of course, as Washington is stepping up its support in unprecedented ways for Taipei. Xi reiterated Beijing's policy that they seek peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but that they will not rule out the use of force. Quote, this is directed solely at interference by outside forces and the few separatists seeking Taiwan independence and their separatist activities. It is by no means targeted at our Taiwan compatriots. Chinese officials have warned explicitly that U.S. support for Taiwan's independence forces could lead to war in the region, but that hasn't slowed Washington's plans to turn the island into a weapons depot, as we discussed last week. While Xi didn't mention the U.S. by name in his speech, he made a veiled reference to the sanctions and other pressure that China has faced from the West since the last National Congress was held 5 years ago, calling it, quote, external blackmail, containment, blockade, and extreme pressure. She is expected to secure a third term during the National Congress, which is being held throughout this week. And again, this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Okay, now this next article from Dave from the 17th. Senate looks to give Taiwan $10 billion in military aid. So the Senate's version of the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act will include $10 billion in military aid for Taiwan. This is according to Defense News from Monday. The $10 billion would be given to Taiwan over 5 years, just like we thought it would be $6.5 billion under the Taiwan Policy Act. And this is going to be in the form of the Foreign Military Financing program, this is the State Department's program where they give foreign governments money to buy American weapons. But Taiwan will be allowed to allocate $300 million of the $2 billion every year to purchase military equipment from its own industrial base, which that's a privilege that is currently only enjoyed by Tel Aviv. Now, other recipients need waivers in order to use the funds to purchase arms from anyone but the U.S. Of course, this is a massive increase from the original $4.5 billion that was initially proposed by Ultra Hawks, the pair of Democratic and Republican neoconservative senators, Bob Menendez, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Lindsey Graham, in a piece of course, they introduced this as the Taiwan Policy Act. But the Senate Foreign Relations Committee increased that to $6.5 billion over 5 years. And that was back in September. But now they've decided to just include the military aid portion in the NDAA. And they increased it, of course, to 10. And that amendment was introduced by Senator Jack Reed, a Democrat from Rhode Island. So just highlighting the bipartisan nature of all of this. The Taiwan Policy Act, of course, it would also boost diplomatic ties with Taipei, increase their standing in all kinds of international institutions. Without formally recognizing Taipei as such, it would basically give them all the benefits of being what's called a major non-NATO ally of the United States, and it would require a massive sanctions regime that targets the political elite of China and key industries across the country in the event of Chinese aggression toward the island, which is the way it's worded in the bill. It's very subjective. And I mean, of course, all of our policies, just like Pelosi's visit, encourage what any outside observer would sort of interpret without the proper context as well, look, this is all Chinese aggression. I mean, they launched the largest ever military exercises around the island after Pelosi's visit and simulated a blockade on the country. So, it's a policy that's designed to cause these kinds of provocations and tensions. Now, the Senate is expected to vote on this NDAA when Congress returns after the midterms in November. Once that's approved, then the House and Senate, of course, will negotiate the final version before it heads to Biden's desk. All right. Now, we have Antony Blinken now claiming that China wants to take Taiwan on a much faster timeline. And there's been lots of calls in response to Blinken's comments saying that we need to mobilize for war with China all over social media from journalists and hawks of different stripes. But this is, again, from Dave DeCamp on October 18th at antiwar.com. We have Blinken on Tuesday said that China is looking to take Taiwan, quote, on a much faster timeline and accused Beijing of wanting to change the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. Blinken, of course, didn't provide evidence for his claim, but he insisted, quote, there's been a change in the approach from Beijing toward Taiwan in recent years. And while Blinken accused China of changing its approach to Taiwan, it's clear the U.S. has changed its policy toward the island in recent years and now views Taipei as an opportunity to counter Beijing. And Dave quotes Raymond Green, who previously was deputy director of the U.S. de facto embassy in Taipei, and how he explained how the approach has changed. He said, quote, the U.S. no longer sees Taiwan as a problem in our relations with China. We see it as an opportunity to advance our shared vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Another significant change, of course, has been, Biden's apparently unilateral overturning of strategic ambiguity in the one China policy. And then, of course, that's all reemphasized by and codified almost by this Taiwan Policy Act and the fact that they're actually debating the one China policy and turning them into a major non-NATO ally. But Biden has, of course, essentially extended this defense commitment to Taiwan. So, of course, our policy has changed quite a bit ourselves. Now, China had reaffirmed again at the UN this week that they have a no first use nuclear weapons policy. And this is from the 19th. This is Dave again at antiwar.com. China reaffirmed this week its no first use policy for nuclear weapons at a meeting of the UN General Assembly's First Committee. So Li Song, the Chinese ambassador for disarmament affairs, told the committee that China has solemnly committed to no first use of nuclear weapons at any time under any circumstances, and not using or threatening to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon or nuclear weapon free zone, non-nuclear weapon states or nuclear weapon free zones unconditionally. China and India are the only two nuclear-armed powers that maintain a no-first-use policy, though the Biden administration's nuclear policy does allow first use, something that was hinted at in the new national security strategy that came out last week. That strategy says, quote, a safe, secure, and effective nuclear force undergirds our defense priorities by deterring strategic attacks, assuring allies and partners, and allowing us to achieve our objectives if deterrence fails. Russia's military doctrine allows the use of nuclear weapons if Russia faces a, quote, existential threat. Putin recently reiterated that this policy applies to threats to Russia's territorial integrity. Lee called on the U.S. and Russia to work to dismantle their nuclear arsenals. Quote, we also believe that the U.S. and Russia, as the nuclear superpowers with the largest nuclear arsenals, should continue to fulfill their special and primary responsibilities toward nuclear disarmament, he said. But, of course, the U.S. has a over $1 trillion plan to modernize the nuclear arsenal, and Biden's new national security strategy actually mentions that, where they emphasize it by saying, quote, to ensure our nuclear deterrent remains responsive to the threats we face, we are modernizing the nuclear triad, nuclear command, control, and communications, and our nuclear weapons infrastructure, the strategy says. And this program was, of course, launched under Obama and expanded by Trump. Okay. Now, another report we have today at antiwar.com by Dave, U.S. considering joint weapons production with Taiwan. The U.S. has approved $20 billion in arms sales for Taiwan since 2017, but there have been some delays. So the U.S. is considering a plan to jointly manufacture weapons with Taiwan to speed up the deliveries. And this is from a member, according to a member of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council uh, from Wednesday. The U.S. Taiwan Business Council again has been very involved in very escalatory arms sales to Taiwan over the years. To give you an idea of what kind of a group they are, Paul Wolfowitz was chairman of the board from 2008 to 2018 and was always a big advocate of those sales. Ultimately, Randall Shriver from the 2049 Institute, Project 2049. Inked when he was in the Defense Department under Trump for these upgraded F-16s and missiles that could be launched from the planes. I think AGM-84Es. I forget what the exact name was, but these can hit targets deep inside China in Nanking. And those sales were refused by the likes of George W. Bush and Barack Obama, but were always advocated for by people like Wolfowitz. But anyway, that's kind of the history, a bit of the history of recent China policy and how this council is involved. But since 2017, the U.S. has approved over $20 billion in arms sales for Taiwan, but the deliveries have been delayed. The island is facing a $14 billion backlog in sales from the U.S., including an $8 billion F-16 deal. Rupert Hammond Chambers, the president of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council, said that the idea of joint production is, quote, right at the beginning of the process. Taiwan has been working to increase the domestic production of missiles and naval vessels, but it's not clear at this point what weapons Washington and Taipei might produce together. Hammond Chambers said it would likely be focused on munitions and missile technology. And Dave notes here that the plan would require obtaining licenses from the State Department and the Pentagon, which could be hesitant to issue them due to concerns of sensitive weapons technology used for U.S. weapons production getting into the wrong hands. But of course, we've seen already that the U.S. is just determined to provide Taiwan with more and more arms. And so that will likely not be as much of a concern. In fact, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago about how they were frustrated. The Pentagon is frustrated that arms sales are being held up by complications like that, where sort of like they just run into sort of bureaucratic red tape. That there's a difficulty. Like, are you sure you want to sell this kind of weapons technology? What if it goes, well, again, like what if it goes into the wrong hands? And then basically they said, well, we just have to figure out how to write the requests differently so that we can get over those hurdles. That was basically the solution that was offered. And they set up a whole task force at the Pentagon basically to see that we could sell more and more weapons, even though we lead the world in by a long shot in global arms exports. But they're basically tying it into like great power competition stuff. So how do we outsell China and Russia? We've covered this before on the show, but it's funny to see them say that. But anyway, yeah. So they're going to probably just override that. And it looks like we're going to continue to arm Taiwan. It's much bigger than previously expected. We know that now.
All right, Connor, thank you for the update. And everybody, thank you again for tuning in. We'll be back with more episodes next week. Probably bad news, but we'll try to do what we can to find some good stuff. Thanks so much, Connor.
Thanks, you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.